Thank you, Sherry, for that highlight. Next, we will jump into our interview with SAE's own Frank Menchaca, our Chief Growth Officer, as well as Michael Paris, new to the Office of Sustainable Energy. Michael Paris, our SAE Strategic Business Development. So thanks, Mike and Frank, for joining us today.
Hello,
Thank
everyone.
you, Kelly. Great to be here.
Welcome. So, Frank, how did SAE come to create the Office of Sustainable Energy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kelly. So SAE has been involved in the development of electric vehicles and sustainable energy vehicles for a long time. We have well over 100 standards on the ground vehicle side and a long history of working on the aerospace side in electric vertical takeoff and landing, as well as in hydrogen. I think the thing that is a little bit different is about a year ago, we started to have a dialogue with some of our stakeholders in industry where we were really learning that there was a tremendous amount of focus moving to beyond the vehicle, moving to the infrastructure. And so most of our work had really been focusing on the vehicle development, and that work still continues. But we really started to hear from our stakeholders that there was a growing interest in infrastructure and how OEMs and suppliers on the aerospace side and the ground vehicle side and on the commercial vehicle side, how were they to start thinking about the inevitable interaction of that vehicle with the infrastructure? And that's really what led us to creating the Office of Sustainable Energy as kind of a center of excellence for really trying to understand that really big picture of sustainability, which includes not only the vehicle, not only the infrastructure, but the interaction with sources of power, electrification, hydrogen, urban design, and smart cities, and all sorts of other disciplines. It's really a way of helping SAE to help the industry to deal with this really large sort of cross-sector, cross-disciplinary development of sustainability. So that's kind of how we got here.
Great. And you somewhat answered this a little bit, but Michael, any thoughts on what do you see as SAE International's role in the rapidly evolving ecosystem?
Absolutely. So the interesting thing, Kelly, that we've uncovered in our discussions with our stakeholders and our global member base, the need for standards is going to be critical, because when we look at the issues that are plaguing industry right now as it pertains to EVs and charging, issues of interoperability, issues of reliability, and issues of accessibility are all critically important to the scaling and the success of electric vehicles. So when you think about reliability, we think about customers that pull up to a gas station to charge their vehicle. We have indication from experts across our global stakeholder base that the failure rate of electric vehicle charging is upwards of 30%. These are numbers that have been validated by our technical experts. They're numbers that have been talked about in government circles as well. So when we think about this problem, one of the most important solutions historically has been standards, and we expect that solution to be critically important now. And just one more point. So when you think, okay, reliability, accessibility, the other important part of this that we're hearing in our work with our stakeholders is that now more than ever, these mobile applications have a critically important role to play in this process, because not only do they indicate where electric vehicle chargers are located, but they come with information such as is power provision is it working on that particular station? Is it available? Is there a customer already parked in that station? Things of this nature are all integrated, and they're all related as you think about the information and you think about the data that is used to understand and then ultimately standardize and think about these technologies in a standardized type of way.
Great. Frank, any thoughts on that before we move forward?
Yeah, just to underscore Mike's point, I think what we encountered when we went out and really talked to industry stakeholders, and we talked to about 200 thought leaders really from across not only the original manufacturers and suppliers, sort of SAE's traditional audience, but also government, infrastructure people, energy. What emerged is there's this very active but very fragmented world out there of sustainability. The transportation industry as a whole is looking to make this shift towards sustainable energy transportation. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing or doing things a little bit differently. And it's a very fragmented landscape. And the message we got was clear. There really needs to be a synthesis of effort. And that's kind of what SAE is good at. We're good at convening people to create a consensus based in really good authoritative technical understanding, create a consensus for moving forward. And we've taken that feedback extremely seriously. And that's kind of what's motivating this office. And at the bedrock of that is standards. So that's, I think, how I see it.
Great. So I think that's a nice segue. So the SAE Office of Sustainable Energy's Strategy Council united quickly around supporting public acceptance of electrified vehicles as a top priority. So Frank, how do you view public acceptance?
Yeah, so we came to this, we put together this strategic advisory council of companies that are really living and breathing this challenge of transferring transportation into sustainable energy vehicles. So some of the best known names in the industry are represented on this council. And we had a lot of ideas about things that we might do. And when we sat down with the strategy council, the message was really clear. There are all of these great ideas. They're all valid. But the first thing we have to do is to create a better user experience for the consumer. There has to be a reliable charging experience. Otherwise, there will be public acceptance will be really challenging. And without public acceptance, we can have the best vehicles and the best design, but without public acceptance, it's really going to be very difficult to get people to put their faith in electric vehicles. So the group really pushed us to think about the whole issue around charging infrastructure from the standpoint of customer experience. How do you create a great, reliable, dependable customer experience as a gateway to increasing public acceptance, which in the end is what's going to drive the scaled distribution and sale of vehicles. So that's really kind of how we approached it.
Great. So Michael, in your opinion, based on the feedback of SAE's technical experts, which factors would contribute to the public buying and using electrified vehicles at scale?
There's a lot of factors, Kelly. I think to reiterate somewhat of what we talked about and Frank just reiterated, reliability and acceptability are going to be two of the biggest. But it really does lead us into another topic. So sustainability as a whole is so broad. There are any number of components in sustainability, from procurement, sustainable procurement of minerals, to the manufacturing process, to the recycling process. The scope of sustainability is very broad. And not only does the public have, we believe, a desire to understand that more thoroughly and wrap their arms around that, but of course the stakeholders that SAE serves, the OEMs and the suppliers and everybody in between. So one of the things that I know Frank is going to share with us a little bit is, what kind of projects is the Office of Sustainable Energy thinking next? One of them is helping industry and helping the public quantify on a scale levels of sustainability. We believe that this idea has been validated. We believe there's a need for it in many different faucets, not just the public and or the autos. So, you can think about any number of applications that would have, but I'll turn it over to Frank to elaborate a little bit on that project, because it is directly related to your question.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So one of the things we wanted to do with the Office of Sustainable Energy is to do something really actionable, get started quickly, and create something that would be of concrete value to the industry. And so what we learned pretty quickly was, to Mike's earlier point, there's a lot of points of failure in the charging experience. A lot of those points of failure are not recorded consistently. In other words, when there's a failure within the charging experience, there are error codes that are created, but there's not a common vocabulary for naming those error codes, and thus there's not a common way of organizing them. It's not a common way of reporting them. So that's something that SAE knows how to do really well from for a long time, both on the aerospace and ground vehicle side. So our first project is really to aggregate and study data coming out of charging stations. We want to study where the charge fails, and we want to study the error codes that are generated by that failure. That involves creating a common vocabulary for those error codes, a data dictionary, for those of you who might be familiar with that terminology. Create a data dictionary of the error codes, examine the failures and the reason behind the failures, create a standard for reporting those errors. And that way we can begin to leverage kind of the accumulated knowledge of everybody studying these error codes around a common set of practices, common set of reporting structures, common set of themes. So we really, one of the big priorities for the Office of Sustainable Energy is to have SAE really dedicate itself to this whole question of reliability and safety, which are things that are really in our DNA from the aerospace side of the world as well as the ground vehicle side. So create best practices and standards that are all about creating a reliable experience, a safe experience, and that's really done through a common data reporting scheme, common data dictionary, and so on. So we really, I think, feel like this is a problem that SAE can solve.
Great. And Frank, before we move forward, are there any other projects you'd like to highlight for the group?
Yeah, so as we get this project stood up, we're looking at a new project, really in the area of the entire life cycle of the battery, how the battery is sourced, how it's manufactured, how it integrates with the grid, bidirectional battery use, battery recycling. There is a lot of need for sets of standards that help to optimize that entire process. As Mike mentioned earlier, and I think you may have mentioned, the creation of electric vehicles is not entirely a carbon-free thing. And so we want to understand everything about the entire life cycle of the battery, to understand what its carbon footprint is, what kind of energy goes into creating it, so that we can really benchmark and understand the sustainability of a particular type of approach. And so that's on the horizon, very much so. And then on the aerospace side, we're standing up another strategy council to look at hydrogen as hydrogen propulsion, not only for the aerospace industry, but also for the long-haul trucking industry, commercial vehicle industry. We think that there's a real opportunity for SAE to leverage its perspective in aerospace and its perspective in ground vehicles to create something that's really unique. The way we tend to look at these things is you have a set of problems for the ground vehicle world, you have a set of problems for aerospace, set of problems for commercial vehicle. In fact, there's a lot to be learned from the experience of one sector for another. The aerospace community is used to highly networked, highly infrastructure dependent systems, and there's a lot we can learn from how they deal with the challenges associated with those and bring that into the automotive and ground vehicle space. We think that with hydrogen, that's an energy source that can span different sectors, and we think SAE is in a position to add some real value there. So those are just some of the things that are on the horizon.
Great, Frank, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I think so much of what we do spans across all three of those sectors, between ground vehicle, aerospace, and commercial vehicle. And being able to have this one office that's able to unite all three of those areas under one common goal is really important. So thank you for that. So electrified vehicles engage with infrastructure in ways that for vehicle manufacturers, suppliers, and government are unprecedented. Energy companies, charging companies, public utilities, federal departments of energy and transportation, as well as state and local governments all have new roles to play. So it's definitely a different ecosystem. So Frank, Mike, from your point of view, what are the most important considerations from operating in it, and what infrastructure needs should we address first?
Well, let me defer to Mike on this one, and I'll fill in whatever spaces he wants me to. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, thank you. So Kelly, that's a great question, and I want to really focus on the first part first. So how do we operate in it? Our stakeholders have been extraordinarily clear about the importance of having the utility companies and the power companies at the table with the automotive manufacturers and government to work on these critically important issues. We've had discussions with various utility providers. We've been fortunate enough to have utility companies on our panels, most recently at WCX. And in fact, here where our headquarters is located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just yesterday we had a meeting with one of the most progressive utility companies in Western Pennsylvania, Duquesne Light. And it was reiterated by Duquesne Light and by these other partners that there are technical issues that are going to demand cooperation between all three. Historically, utility companies, largely due to their regulatory structure, have not necessarily had the same compelling reasons to be at the negotiating table for standards with standards organizations and other government entities, just because they are guided by regulation from the federal government, and so that need hasn't historically been there. They are seeing the need. They are seeing the technical challenges related to power provision for electric vehicles, and it's critically important. And to address another part of your question, right now all 50 states are in the process of preparing their state plans to submit to the federal government by August that are outlining what they're going to do with federal funding to implement EV chargers in their states. So they're responsible for talking about things like safety and things like training programs for installation and maintenance of electric vehicle chargers in a safe way. They're tasked with talking about things like accessibility and geography. How do we fundamentally place electric vehicle chargers in an equitable and an efficient manner? So these are all questions that are directly relating to the things that SAE is talking about with our stakeholders that standards both address historically and will address in the future. So to answer your question the long way around, communication of all parties is going to be absolutely essential to the success of electric vehicle technology.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Frank, anything you'd like to add in?
Yeah, let me just pick up on a couple of threads in Mike's comments. I think something that we're thinking about, that industry is thinking about, is really the social implications of electric vehicles. Right now, the electric vehicles, I think, are seen as kind of luxury items that only a small handful of people can afford, and maybe they have the luxury of having other vehicles that they can, supplement those vehicles with. We talked about public acceptance earlier. I think that the only way we can get to mass public acceptance of electric vehicles is for them to be more accessible from a price consideration. And that also means for the charging infrastructure to be available to people everywhere from all walks of life. So we find ourselves not only having technical conversations, but talking about the sociological aspects of infrastructure. How do you make transportation accessible to people in the 21st century, no matter what their background is, to get to education, to have access to healthcare, to have access to jobs? That really has to be part of our planning. If we're really looking to create clean energy transportation, then it has to be equitable. and it has to be available to a diversity of people as much as possible. So I think what we're talking about sustainability, we're not just talking about a set of technologies. We're not just talking about decarbonizing. We're talking about a new way of approaching infrastructure in general. And that means that we have to include policy people, we have to include academia, we have to include companies of all kinds, players of all kinds in this world. I mentioned before that the scenario that we encounter out there is kind of a fragmented one, maybe a kind of cloak of many colors or with lots of pieces. We really need to put on our best thinking and try and synthesize this into an infrastructure that is accessible to as many people as possible. So those are some big topics. But I think it would not be doing sustainability a service if we didn't mention that has to really be part of the discussion.
And I think that's such a great point, Frank, as you talk about public acceptance. I think that's one of the biggest, pieces of this conversation is if you don't have a garage or a designated parking spot or someplace to charge, that's a huge point to focus on. So it's great to hear that this office is putting a focus there.
Yep, very much so.
Awesome. So you talked a little bit before about battery sourcing. So sustainable energy-based transportation requires new supply chains in terms of battery sourcing and manufacture, bidirectional use, and recycling. That's a big topic, recycling of these batteries. So what role can SAE play as it pertains to the key issues in supply chain development to meet the industry's needs?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think when I think about what SAE is good at, we're good at being a bridge between industry and the academic world and the government. And I think with sustainability, we really have to work even harder at being that kind of bridge organization that brings together industry, that brings together government and brings together academia to work on these solutions. Battery sourcing is not only a technical issue, it's a geopolitical issue. 60% of the electric vehicle battery manufacturing is in China. And so you increasingly get into a position where when you start to think about battery sourcing, it becomes a question of policy, becomes a question almost of national security to have access or means to create these energy sources as openly as you can. So what do I think SAE can bring to that? I think we can facilitate. We don't necessarily take positions in these areas, but I think we can facilitate that dialogue. And what we can do is to create best practices that really help industry to scale. And I think that really means having this open dialogue between industry and government and academia.
Mike, any thoughts on that?
Kelly, I think that was a really nice summation. I know you have a couple more questions for us. I don't think I would add anything. That was very well summarized.
Great. So Mike, our final question: what are some of your short-term goals within the business development front?
Absolutely, that's a great question as well. To Kelly, to speak to the things that we've been talking about today, it's important that we frame SAE's capabilities as being more broad than standards development. We have a global portfolio of over 300 training courses, many of which are related to quality assurance and quality management, which is a component of the question you just asked. Because when I think about supply chain and what SAE can bring to it, I think quality management and quality assurance are at the core of supply chain management of vendors, management of parts and materials, et cetera. So we have a storied history on that front as well. But when we think about the demands and the needs on the infrastructure side, one of the things that we are very focused on is training. In the sense that we have heard from our constituents that there is an immense need to have engineers who are traditionally ICE or powertrain engineers ready to make the transition to being an electric vehicle engineer. We all know that the amount of parts and components in the vehicle is vastly reduced with an electric vehicle. but that doesn't necessarily mean it's any less complex. So understanding the design elements, understanding the electrical engineering elements, understanding the standards and essential protocols that are involved with the vehicle plug or that are involved with the communication standards between vehicle and infrastructure uh, are all going to be extremely important. But I would leave it with the fact that safety is also going to be extremely important. So as we think about the type of training course that we want to put out for industry and government, we are thinking about how are we going to ensure that not only are the design engineers who are making an electric vehicle charger, but the installation and maintenance people who are servicing them and the general public who is using them every day are safe? What if there's an issue with damage to the electric vehicle charger? How does one assess the safety and the critical safety risks with an issue with an electric vehicle charger? What's the implication if there's water damage to an electric vehicle charger? And what are the implications for installation and maintenance? These are all questions that SAE is asking itself because we know that they're questions that our customers and our stakeholders are asking themselves. So as we think about partnerships and we think about other development opportunities, training on essential standards and protocols, training on safety are top of mind. And we're also thinking critically about various certification programs. We know that there are existing labs, both in the United States and Europe and in Asia, that are qualified to certify against certain standards, for example, communication standards of electric vehicle chargers. That exists, but there's a need for compliance standards. There's a need for compliance programs so that there's the ability of charging operators or network providers or a site host to be able to comply with these standards without necessarily have to pay an auditor to come in and conduct that type of service. So these are all things that we're thinking about. We think there's a role for certification and compliance programs. We think our standards and our network is capable of supporting that. So training and compliance, Kelly, are two things that we're thinking critically about.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. And we do have a few questions in the chat. We may not have time to get to them all, but I do want to address a couple of these. And Frank, Mike, I'll leave you to decide who can answer. But we have Jacob from Daimler Truck asking, how much standards and collaborative development work is happening around charge in motion?
Yeah, so Jacob, that's a great question. We've been talking about traditional charging infrastructure, but as you may or may not know, SAE also has active committees in wireless charging and in charge in motion. So there is work going on. I think that there is a feeling that there is a need maybe to address the current infrastructure, but that said, there's a lot of work going on in these other forms of charging. We're also doing some work in the area when we talk about hydrogen propulsion. We're doing some work in trying to look at how the airport can be redefined as an energy hub, a place not only where people come to take flights, but also to charge. If there is this successful development of hydrogen propulsion, there may be a new role for the airport as a charging hub for long-haul trucking. So a short answer to your question is that there's a lot of work going on. We've talked here about the emphasis on traditional charging because that is the thing that is to hand. It's where a lot of federal funding in the U.S. is going for development, and we think it's an area that can use some standardization. So thank you for your question. I hope that was useful.
Great.
And Frank, I can actually add one thing to that, Jacob. So underneath the Hybrid Electric Vehicle Committee, there are subcommittees, and then there are task forces. One of which is called an interoperability task force, and while that particular task force may or may not be the exact place that your question pertains to, I want to share with the group that when engineers are at the table at standards committees with SAE, and there is the validated need for particular subtopics such as what you've just explained, those task forces can be spun up. They can be spun up based on validated use cases, based on need and demand and consensus of the committee. So if you're not already involved, or if there's a team at Daimler who is very focused on this particular issue, these task forces can be established to go off and address issues very quickly and nimbly. So that's something to keep in mind is an option.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Mike. We only have time for probably one or two more questions. Michael had a question in the chat. Any comments on the latest CARB Advanced Clean Cars 2 proposal, efforts to create a reliable EV market and used market, and any way for SAE to help with these efforts?
I could try to address that. It's a great question. CARB and the California Air Resources Board and CEC are both extraordinarily active. We know that there's a lot of pending requests for information. We know that there is a big push in the state of California to take a lead on this, perhaps somewhat because they don't want to wait for the federal government's direction. But irregardless, the answer is SAE is active in some of these discussions. We have a federal affairs program and a government relations team that supports federal program management, standards program management. They're based in Washington, D.C. We address both the aerospace and the automotive side of SAE's business. So when you think, how are we contributing? How are we participating? We do file comments when there's requests for information. We don't necessarily get into some of the others, but we're a non-lobbying organization, I should say. So there's no lobbying, but there is interaction with the government. We provide our technical insight, which largely comes directly from the committees, and then is provided in proper filings to the government agencies. But we are aware of the active work happening in California. We know that it's important, and we have several customers on our strategic advisory council, or partners, I should say, that are in California and keeping us very aware of what CARB and CEC are up to.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Frank, anything to add to that? I think Mike gave a really great summarization there.
No, nothing to add. Mike did a great job there.
Great. So we are just about at time here. Frank, Mike, any closing comments or anything you'd like to address with the group before we move forward?
I think nothing further from me. I think we really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about our project. I think it has some very big implications for SAE and for the industry, and we look forward to further cooperation.
Yes, and I would just say thank you, everybody. It was a great discussion. It's a very exciting time at SAE and with our member base, our global member base, because this is an incredibly important topic. It's exciting everyone to get up every day and work on these kinds of solutions. And we're also very excited that industry and government fully recognize the place that standards have in sustainability, which is an important one.